Okay, welcome back. We are in Matthew chapter 24, beginning to unpack the Olivet Discourse, and we're going to be reading about things that Jesus predicted that have yet to be fulfilled. However, there is quite a bit of controversy about the Olivet Discourse, and I'm going to discuss that controversy, and I'm going to give you some of the possible sides that you could take, and I'm going to tell you what I think, okay? The questions that were posed by the disciples that precipitated then this Olivet Discourse are found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels. Matthew records them asking three questions. We read from this previously in Matthew 24 and verse number 3. When will these things happen? That has to be a direct reference to the destruction of the temple. Number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? Which there's no indication that Jesus previously mentioned anything about his coming. In fact, I guess the question could be asked, why would they even be asking about his coming when they didn't even believe he was going at this point in time? You know, they thought he was about to set up his kingdom. They didn't believe what he had told them about he was going to be crucified and raised from the dead and so forth. So that's an odd question, it seems. And then the third question is, and the end of the age. So we want to know what's going to happen at the end of time. Now, if we compare that with Mark and Luke's Gospels, it begins to raise some questions because in Mark chapter 13 and verse number 4, here's how Mark records it. Tell us, when will these things be? That's like the first question that Matthew recorded. And what will be the sign when all of these things are going to be fulfilled? So clearly just focusing on the destruction of the temple, which Jesus had, been predicting. All right, Luke's Gospel. Luke chapter 21 and verse number 7, they questioned him saying, "Teacher, when therefore will these things happen?" Just like the first question Matthew recorded. And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Just like the second question as Mark recorded it, and it seems to be related directly to the first question in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, talking about the destruction of the temple. Now, for that reason, scholars debate, and they've been debating this, I suppose, for as long as Matthew, Mark, and Luke have been around. The things that Jesus talks about in the ensuing Olivet Discourse, is he talking about what's going to happen prior to the destruction of the temple, which we look at as, historically in the past, 70 AD, or is he talking about the things that will precede his second coming at the end of the world, as it were? Or is he kind of talking about both? And if he's talking about both, when does the one end and the other begin? When does he answer the first question and go on to the second and third questions as Matthew recorded them? Or is there a blending? These are the questions that people have been asking for a long time. I'll tell you my viewpoint. I'm tempted to think that Matthew, in trying to make this more clear to his readers, kind of took some liberty and added to the questions that the disciples asked, knowing that the answer that Jesus ultimately gave had application to the second coming of Jesus and the end of the age. Okay? Now, I don't know whether that's a fact or not, and that maybe seems like heretical to some people who are viewing me that I would say such a thing. But if we only had Mark and Luke's Gospels, we would be very tempted to think that, we'd start reading, we think, well, he's talking about when there's going to be the destruction of the temple. And all these signs, predate the destruction of the temple, which we know now, they didn't know then, but we know now, happened in 70 AD. But then even in Mark and Luke's Gospel, near the end of the Olivet Discourse, on the, you get this distinct impression, well, wait a second, he's talking about him coming back and cataclysmic type stuff, end of the world type stuff, not, stuff that predates the destruction of Jerusalem, And if you read Matthew's Gospel, of course, you're anticipating that kind of information based upon the questions that Matthew says the disciples asked. Okay, so it is my opinion that as we read the Olivet Discourse, at least the initial part of it, we're reading about signs that would go before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospel. That Luke's Gospel gives us even more information about that than Matthew and Mark do. And we're also reading about signs that will predate, the second coming of Jesus Christ and the end of the age. Okay, now the next question. Where's the break? Where does Jesus stop talking about signs that would predate the destruction of the temple, and where does he start talking about signs that would, predate his second coming? That's much more difficult to answer. And I'll share this with you, that if you read Old Testament prophecies about coming destructions and so forth, you often see this phenomena. Some theologians refer to it as the law of double reference. That is, you read a prophecy, something that's going to happen in the future, and it has two references. It has a reference to some imminent thing that's going to take place, and then it also has a reference to something that's far off in the future. And so there's a blending, as it were, of imminent and far off, distant future stuff, and you really can't delineate where one ends and where the other begins. It's a blending. There are signs that predate both the imminent and the far off occurrence that's being addressed in that prophetic part of Scripture. And I think that's probably the same case here. And if that is true, then, and having the advantage of history being behind us, we can look at the history of what happened before 70 A.D., but we can't look ahead. Christ hasn't returned yet. Okay, and so we can look here and say, well, here's what's going to predate the return of Christ. Okay, now I know that doesn't answer every question. That raises some questions, and I'm sorry about that. I'm doing the best I can. But next time, we're going to start diving into this and see how it applies to you and to me. Okay? Looking forward to it. And so I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.